Karen stood in the quiet hallway outside the accounting office, holding the thin envelope that had just ended her career. The letter said her employment was terminated for financial misconduct, words that felt heavy and cruel against everything she believed about herself. 2 co-workers passed by without meeting her eyes, whispering softly as if she were already guilty. Inside the office, Tom leaned against the doorframe with folded arms, watching her pack her things into a small cardboard box. "Company policy is company policy," he said with a shrug that sounded almost amused. Karen lifted her head slowly and replied, "I know what I did and what I didn't do." Tom only smiled and walked away as if the matter were finished. As Karen stepped outside the building into the cold afternoon air, she realized her reputation, her income, and years of hard work had been taken away in a single meeting. 3 months earlier, Karen had been one of the most trusted employees in the company's finance department. She arrived early every morning, greeting the security guard with a cheerful "Good morning, Mr. Lewis," before settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee. Tom worked in the same department and had recently been promoted to senior financial coordinator, a position Karen once hoped to earn. At first he treated her kindly, often stopping by her desk to ask questions about reports or procedures. "You're the most organized person here," he once told her with a friendly laugh. Karen believed him and gladly helped whenever he asked. But over time she noticed small things that made her uneasy, like numbers being moved between accounts without clear explanation. When she politely questioned one entry involving $20,000, Tom waved his hand and said, "Relax, it's just temporary accounting adjustments." Karen tried to trust that explanation, yet something in Tom's tone stayed with her for days. One evening she stayed late reviewing quarterly reports when she noticed another unusual transfer listed under Tom's authorization. The amount was larger this time, nearly $50,000 moving from one vendor account into another. Karen quietly printed the page and carried it to Tom's office the next morning. "Tom, I just want to make sure this line here is correct," she said, pointing carefully at the numbers. Tom glanced at the sheet for barely a second before leaning back in his chair. "You worry too much," he replied casually. Karen hesitated and said, "It's just that our audit is coming soon." Tom's smile tightened slightly as he answered, "That's exactly why you should stop digging into things that don't concern you." From that moment the atmosphere between them began to change. Tom stopped asking Karen for help and instead started criticizing small details in her work during team meetings. "These numbers are sloppy," he said one afternoon, dropping a report on her desk even though the figures were correct. Karen felt embarrassed but answered calmly, "If something needs correction, I'll fix it." The following week Tom called her into his office and spoke in a colder tone than she had ever heard before. "You need to stay in your lane," he told her bluntly. Karen folded her hands and replied, "I only want the accounts to be accurate." Tom leaned forward across his desk and said quietly, "Accuracy isn't the only thing that matters in business." Karen left his office that day with a strange feeling that something much bigger was unfolding behind those numbers. The real trouble began 2 weeks later when the company's internal audit team suddenly arrived. Managers walked through the department requesting files, invoices, and transaction records for several accounts Karen had reviewed before. Tom stood confidently beside the auditors, answering their questions with practiced calm. When one auditor asked about the questionable transfers, Tom pointed toward Karen's workstation and said, "She handled most of those reconciliations." Karen felt her stomach tighten as every eye in the room turned toward her. "I only reviewed the reports," she explained carefully. Tom shook his head slowly and added, "Actually, the entries were made under her login credentials." The room fell silent, and Karen realized with a quiet shock that the numbers she had questioned weeks earlier were now being used to accuse her. Tom crossed his arms and said calmly, "Maybe Karen can explain where the money went." Karen sat in the small conference room while 2 auditors studied the financial records spread across the table. Her hands rested calmly in her lap even though her heart felt like it was beating in her ears. One auditor looked up and asked, "Karen, can you explain why these transfers were approved under your credentials?" Karen leaned forward and answered honestly, "I never approved those transfers. I only reviewed reports that Tom prepared." Across the table Tom let out a quiet laugh and said, "That's not how the system logs show it." Karen turned toward him and said carefully, "I questioned those entries weeks ago." Tom shrugged and replied, "You never said anything to management." The auditors exchanged a glance, clearly unsure what to believe. Karen realized that the system records truly showed her login information, which meant someone had used her credentials. Later that afternoon, Karen was escorted to the Human Resources office where the department manager sat waiting. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy with quiet judgment. The manager slid a printed report across the table and said, "These transactions total nearly $70,000. Karen studied the pages slowly and recognized every line she had once questioned. "I didn't move this money," she said firmly. Tom sat beside the manager and added in a concerned voice, "Karen has always worked hard, but sometimes people make mistakes." Karen looked directly at him and replied, "This isn't a mistake." The manager sighed and said, "The records show your login was used each time." Karen explained that she never shared her password and always logged out of the system. But Tom simply shook his head and said quietly, "We all trusted you." Within a week, the company made its decision. Karen's employment was terminated while the finance department announced an internal investigation into the missing funds. She packed her desk slowly while whispers spread through the office like cold wind. One coworker muttered, "I never thought she'd do something like that." Another shook his head and said, "Money changes people." Karen carried her box to the elevator with quiet dignity, refusing to argue with rumors she could not yet prove wrong. Outside the building, she called her younger brother Daniel and told him what had happened. Daniel listened carefully before asking, "Do you believe someone framed you?" Karen took a deep breath and answered, "Yes." Daniel paused before saying, "Then the truth will come out eventually." Karen replied softly, "It will, but it might take time." The months that followed were some of the hardest Karen had ever faced. Without a job and with her reputation damaged, many companies refused to consider her applications. At interviews, she could see the moment hiring managers recognized the scandal connected to her name. One recruiter even said gently, "Your skills are impressive, but the circumstances around your last position raise concerns." Karen always answered calmly, "I understand." She never blamed anyone during those conversations, choosing instead to remain respectful and patient. Meanwhile, Tom continued thriving at the company, even receiving praise for cooperating with the investigation. One former coworker told Karen over the phone, "Tom looks like the hero who caught the problem." Karen closed her eyes briefly and replied, "Sometimes the truth takes longer than lies." Despite the hardship, Karen refused to surrender her integrity or her determination to understand what really happened. She spent evenings carefully reviewing copies of old reports she had saved on a personal drive before leaving the company. Slowly, she began noticing patterns in the financial records, especially the timing of the suspicious transfers. Every transaction happened late in the evening when most employees had already gone home. Karen also remembered that Tom often stayed late, claiming he had extra work to finish. One night, Daniel looked over her shoulder at the documents and asked, "Why would he use your login?" Karen answered thoughtfully, "Because people trusted me." Daniel nodded slowly and said, "Then somewhere there must be proof." Karen leaned back in her chair and said quietly, "Yes, and if the truth exists, I'll find it." Weeks turned into months, yet Karen continued searching through the records with quiet determination. She organized every report, email, and document she had saved into careful folders on her laptop. One evening, Daniel sat beside her and asked, "What exactly are you looking for now?" Karen pointed to a series of timestamps printed on several transactions and said, "These transfers happened after 7 in the evening every time." Daniel frowned and replied, "But you always left work before 6. Karen nodded slowly and said, "Exactly." She began listing the dates on a notepad, remembering that Tom often stayed late during those same evenings. "If someone accessed my account after I left, there must be another system record," she said thoughtfully. Daniel leaned forward and asked, "Like security logs?" Karen looked at him with a small spark of hope and answered, "Yes, building access records." The next morning, Karen visited the office building where she had once worked, hoping to speak with someone in the security department. The receptionist looked surprised to see her but politely called the security supervisor. After a few minutes, a tall man named Mr. Harris stepped into the lobby and recognized her immediately. "Karen, I remember you," he said kindly. Karen explained carefully that she was trying to understand the timing of certain financial transactions connected to her old department. Mr. Harris listened patiently before saying, We keep entry logs for every employee badge. Karen felt her heart beat faster and asked quietly, would those records show who stayed in the building late? Mr. Harris nodded slowly. Yes, they show when people enter and leave each night. Karen looked down for a moment before asking, could you check the dates I wrote here? Mr. Harris returned about 10 minutes later holding a printed sheet of building access records. Karen studied the lines carefully, her eyes moving across each timestamp. On every date connected to the suspicious financial transfers, Tom's badge appeared entering the finance office late in the evening. Karen's badge, however, showed she had already exited the building hours earlier. Mr. Harris pointed at the records and said, looks like you were gone before 8 every one of those nights. Karen nodded slowly and replied, that matches my memory. He tapped another column and added, but Tom stayed past 10 on several of them. Karen thanked him sincerely and folded the papers into her folder. As she walked outside into the sunlight, she felt something she had not felt in months. Quiet confidence that the truth was beginning to surface. Karen knew that security logs alone would not prove everything, so she continued searching for more pieces of the puzzle. She contacted an old coworker named Melissa who had once worked in the same accounting department. They met in a small cafe where Melissa listened carefully to Karen's explanation. I always thought something about that situation felt strange, Melissa admitted quietly. Karen showed her the building access records and asked, did Tom ever ask about my login information? Melissa hesitated before answering, actually yes. Karen leaned forward and asked, what do you mean? Melissa took a slow sip of her coffee and said, one afternoon he joked that you had the easiest password to remember because you wrote it down once while fixing a system error. Karen felt a chill pass through her as the memory returned. That evening Karen reviewed every email exchange she had ever had with Tom, searching for anything connected to system access or account permissions. Near the bottom of an old message thread she found something she had almost forgotten. Months earlier Tom had asked her to help reset a finance program that kept rejecting his login credentials. Karen had briefly logged into the system from his computer to correct the issue while he stood beside her desk. She remembered writing her password on a small sticky note during the process because the system required several steps. Daniel looked at the email and said quietly, so he could have seen it. Karen nodded slowly and replied, yes. She closed the laptop gently and added, and if he used that password after I left work, then everything he accused me of begins to fall apart. Karen understood that suspicion alone would never clear her name, so she began carefully organizing every piece of evidence she had gathered. She placed the building access logs beside the printed financial transfers and highlighted the matching dates. Each line showed the same pattern. The money moved late at night, long after she had left the building. Daniel studied the documents and said quietly, this already tells a strong story. Karen nodded but replied calmly, it tells a story, but it needs proof that cannot be ignored. She knew the company would not reopen the case unless something forced them to look again. That meant she needed more than just timing and access records. She needed something that connected Tom directly to the transactions themselves. 2 weeks later Karen received an unexpected phone call from Melissa. Her voice sounded slightly nervous as she said, Karen, something strange happened at the office today. Karen straightened in her chair and asked, what kind of strange? Melissa explained that the finance department had begun another internal review because several vendor accounts were showing small discrepancies again. Tom looked very tense during the meeting, Melissa added quietly. Karen listened carefully before asking, did anyone question him directly? Melissa paused before answering, not yet, but one of the auditors asked for detailed system login reports. Karen felt a calm wave of understanding pass through her and said softly, that means someone else has noticed the pattern. Later that evening Melissa called again with more news. Karen, you're not going to believe this, she said quickly. Karen asked, what happened? Melissa lowered her voice and replied, the IT department found something unusual in the system logs. According to the report, Karen's login credentials had been used on several nights when her employee badge never entered the building. The IT technician mentioned that remote login from Tom's office computer appeared in the same timestamps. Melissa explained, they're starting to ask questions about how that could happen. Karen closed her eyes for a moment and said quietly, because someone used my credentials after I left. Melissa whispered, exactly. For the first time since losing her job, Karen felt the slow movement of truth beginning to push forward. A week later, Karen received a formal email from the company requesting a meeting with the audit committee. The message was polite but serious, asking her to bring any documents she believed were relevant to the previous investigation. Daniel read the email over her shoulder and asked, "Do you think they finally suspect Tom?" Karen answered calmly, "I think they are starting to see what they missed." On the day of the meeting, she walked back into the same office building she had left months earlier carrying a simple folder of evidence. Several employees glanced at her with quiet curiosity as she passed through the hallway. Karen entered the conference room where the department manager, 2 auditors and Tom were already seated. The room felt tense as Karen placed her folder on the table and sat down across from Tom. One of the auditors began speaking first. "New information has come to light regarding the financial transfers from last quarter," he said carefully. Tom shifted slightly in his chair but forced a confident smile. "I'm sure Karen will try to defend herself again," he said casually. Karen opened her folder and calmly placed the building access logs beside the printed transaction reports. "These records show I was not in the building during the transfers," she explained. Then she slid forward the system login report Melissa had mentioned. "But someone using my credentials was." The room grew very quiet as the auditor studied the timestamps and slowly turned his eyes toward Tom. The silence in the conference room stretched long enough for everyone to feel the weight of the documents on the table. One auditor leaned closer to the printed system logs and traced a finger across the timestamps. "These logins originated from Tom's office computer," he said slowly. Tom straightened in his chair and forced a small laugh. "That doesn't prove anything," he replied. Karen remained calm and said, "You asked me months ago how those transfers happened." She gently tapped the page. "Now the system is answering that question." The department manager looked toward Tom with a serious expression and asked, "Can you explain why Karen's credentials were used from your workstation late at night?" Tom opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time since the meeting began, his voice hesitated. The auditors requested a short break to review the evidence more carefully. Tom stepped into the hallway while Karen remained seated quietly at the table. She watched through the glass wall as the auditors spoke with the IT technician who had arrived with additional system reports. When the meeting resumed, the lead auditor placed another document on the table. "We found something else," he said. The report showed that the password used for Karen's account had been changed shortly after the first suspicious transfer. The request for that password change came directly from Tom's workstation. The auditor looked directly at him and asked calmly, "Why would you reset another employee's login credentials?" Tom's confidence faded as he replied weakly, I was helping with system maintenance." Karen spoke only once more, her voice steady and respectful. "Months ago Tom asked me to reset a program on his computer," she explained. "During that process I wrote my password down briefly while fixing the system error." She paused before adding, "He was standing right beside me." The room grew quiet again as the pieces began to align clearly. The department manager folded his hands and said firmly, "Tom, this evidence suggests you used Karen's credentials to move company funds." Tom tried to protest, but the explanations he offered contradicted the system reports in front of them. After several tense minutes, the auditors concluded the meeting with a direct statement. "We believe the transfers were executed from Tom's computer using Karen's credentials without her authorization." Within days, the company issued an official correction to the investigation report. Tom was removed from his position and placed under a formal financial inquiry while the missing funds were traced through vendor accounts. The company also released a written statement acknowledging that Karen had been wrongly accused and dismissed based on incomplete information. When Karen returned to the office to receive the letter, several former co-workers approached her quietly. One of them said, "We're sorry we believed the rumors." Karen smiled gently and replied, "I understand why it was confusing." The department manager then offered her the opportunity to return to the company with a higher position overseeing financial compliance. Karen considered the offer carefully but ultimately chose a different path. She had already begun working with a smaller firm that valued her honesty and patience during difficult times. When the manager asked if she would reconsider returning, Karen shook her head kindly and said, "What mattered most was the truth." As she walked out of the building one final time, the weight she had carried for months finally lifted. Daniel later asked her if she felt angry about everything that had happened. Karen smiled quietly and answered, "No." Time revealed what lies tried to hide. The lesson of the entire experience stayed with her for the rest of her life. Integrity may move slowly, but when truth finally arrives, it speaks louder than any accusation.